Hi there, my name is Thymen Wabeke. I work as a research engineer at SIDN Labs, and we are the registry of .nl. In this talk, I will present our research on detecting and taking down thousands of malicious web shops. I would like to start with a question. I do this always in my presentations, but it's kind of hard because we're in a remote conference, of course, but still I would like to try. So please raise your hand if you ever bought something online. I guess all your hands should be raised by it now, because buying stuff online is, well, really common. So let's imagine you want to buy some new clothes. Then you go to a web shop, and I will give you an example of such a web shop. This is a web shop in the .nl zone where you can buy some nice clothes. It looks really nice, this shop. It's well designed. You can see some popular brands. The domain itself is also very trustworthy. Nederlandwebshop.nl, that's a direct translation of Netherlands web shop. So that's trustworthy. And most of all for consumers, and we are all consumers, what's very important is that this shop has some pretty good discounts. Instead of 100 euros for some clothes, you pay 70 euros. So that's a good discount. And my question to you is, would you buy something on this web shop? I think the average Joe would do that, but then you would be scammed, because it turns out that this web shop is a fake or a counterfeit web shop. If you buy something on this web shop, nothing will arrive, or you will get a cheap, lower quality version of the original product. So in this project, we talk about counterfeit or fake web shops, and those web shops, they scam users because users are not aware that they buy fake products. And that's a totally different game compared to buying fake goods offline, for example, on a street market. If you're on holiday and you see a pair of sunglasses at such a market, you can assume, you're quite certain that this pair of sunglasses might be fake. But if you buy something online, for example, on the web shop I just showed you, it's really difficult to estimate for an average user whether a web shop is delivering fake goods or not. So these losses of consumers who are unaware of fake goods, they have been reported in the news. I put a screenshot on the top right of this slide showing a news article of NOS. NOS is sort of the Dutch BBC, and here they're saying that consumers are being scammed for 5 million euros. Because of fake web shops. So these losses, they're quite huge. And we as the registry of .nl are pretty concerned about those losses, because we're afraid that the user may experience less trust in the internet because of those fake web shops. So we wanted to do something about those fake web shops. And as a registry, we also have the perfect vantage point. For example, we have the list of all 5.9 million .nl domain names. And in addition to the list of domain names, we also have some measurements. So for example, we have data about the registration, who is data, but we also have some active and passive measurements that tell us something about the infrastructure that domain names use, but also something about the content that is being hosted on domain names. So as SIDN, we are focusing on fake web shops, and we do that for a couple of years. We started with this project in 2016, and since then we have detected thousands of domain names and also helped to take down quite a few. And by doing so, we ultimately protected users from being scammed. So I think that's really a good thing. And we also got some attention from the media for this. So again, I put some screenshots on the slide of, you see RIPE, of course, but there are also some Dutch media, Dutch websites that cover our projects, which we're pretty proud of. But in this presentation, I will mainly focus on the scientific part. So I will talk about 2 case studies. And in those case studies, we developed and also evaluated 2 detection systems. The first case study that I will cover is about Brand Counter. We developed this detection system a couple of years ago in 2018. And I will also talk about fake detector, or FADE, which we detected over a year ago. So that's sort of the content of this presentation. And it's centered around 3 research questions. The first 2 research questions are closely related to the 2 case studies. In both case studies, we try to answer first, how many counterfeit web shops are there in our zone, in the .nl DNS zone? And the second question is how to take such counterfeit web shops offline. What can we actually do about it to protect users? And finally, at the end of the presentation, I will zoom in a bit on the suspicious domain names themselves. Are there some patterns there? Can we learn something about how the counterfeiters operate? So let's start with the first case study that's centered around brand counter. Back in 2016, we were doing some research on phishing domain names. And then we stumbled upon fake web shops. So those were web shops that offered high demand consumers goods at pretty good discounts. And we also saw that the pages had some similarities. They had very long HTML page titles that listed a lot of brands. So for example, Nike, Reebok, or other brands. And we think they do that because it helps them to get a higher ranking at Google and other search engines. So given this observation, we thought, how could we see whether there are more shops like these within our zone? So we created a really simple detector, which just consists of a list of brands and discounts related words. And we also created a tool that crawls the HTML pages of all .nl websites. And then we just counted the number of words, discount and brand related words were in the page titles, and if that was above an arbitrary threshold of 5 suspicious words, then we mark that domain name as suspicious. Well, this tool is relatively simple. It's so simple that we actually didn't thought it would work, but in fact it did work, as you can see on the graph in this slide. What you can see here on the x-axis is a couple of scans that we performed on our zone, and on the y-axis you see in purple the number of suspicious domain names that we detected. And as you can see, in August 2017 we detected a little bit over 12,000 suspicious domain names, and the number of suspicious domain names also decreases relatively fast. But I would also like to focus now on a couple of notifications that we performed, because we as SIDN, as the registry of .nl, have ourselves limited possibilities to take down domain names. So we had to partner with registrars, and we choose here to partner with a single registrar. We call this registrar A, because this registrar was on its own responsible for over 40% of the suspicious domain names. So we partnered with this registrar and we notified them about over 4,000 counterfeit web shops. And as you can see on the graph on the right side, we did this 3 times. The first notification in January 2018 was the largest, and then we did 2 smaller notifications. And as you can see in purple, most of the notified domain names were actually took down. In total, 3,708 domain names were taken down by this registrar, which is a huge success for us. But let's go back to the initial graph, where we show the number of suspicious domain name that Brand Counter detected. What you can see here is, of course, that there is a sharp decrease, and that could mean a couple of things. Well, it could, for example, mean that the counterfeiters have given up, or what could also happen here is that our very simple tool, Brand Counter, just stopped working because the counterfeiters learned what we were doing. They could easily trick our systems by just using less suspicious brand-related words in their HTML titles. And to get a feeling of what was happening here, we decided to create a novel, a bit more intelligent detection system, which is called Fake Detector. This new detector, we had some requirements for it. We didn't want to be dependent on the page titles anymore because it seemed that it didn't work anymore. And we also didn't want to be too much biased towards our own perspective because we were in this topic for a couple of years now. So you develop sort of a bias, by nature. So we wanted to cooperate with the different organization and also an organization that has a more direct relationship with consumers. So we head out to ICS, which is a large credit card issuer in the Netherlands, and we collaborated with them. And they provided us of a list of suspicious domain names, counterfeit web shops that were actually involved in scams. This was a list of 231 domain names, and we developed a supervised machine learning tool to create a classification model that could distinguish between trustworthy web shops and suspicious web shops on the other hand. And the pipeline that we followed for this supervised machine learning problem was basically the textbook pipeline. So we started with a data set. On one hand, we had the counterfeit samples that were reported by ICS. And we also manually sampled an equal number of legitimate web shops. And we manually verified whether those web shops were trustworthy. And then we generated a couple of features. We used 9 features. I won't go into detail here. In the paper, you can read all the features in detail and also with some references to earlier work. But 6 of the features, they were related to registrations. So this means, for example, that we used the hour of registration as a feature and also the email provider that the registrant used to register its domain name. And we also had a couple of infrastructure related features. So here we look at the fact whether a domain name has a mail server configured or not, because we observed that the counterfeiters usually don't invest that much effort in setting up things that won't generate more money. So setting up a mail server costs you time, that's effort, and it don't generate extra money. So the next step then is to split the data into training samples and test samples. We use 80% of the data for training and 20% to evaluate the final model. For training, we used a supervised vector machine. This method is a traditional machine learning method that is relatively simple, has less risk of overfitting, and performed pretty well. Of course, SVM has some parameters, some settings that you can tune, and we use grid search in combination with cross-validation to tune those settings. The final model was then applied to our test samples to get a feeling of how it would generalize. And in the table below, on the bottom of this slide, you can see the results. So the cross-validation results were pretty good, but also the test results were quite good. Of course, our test set was small, but this at least indicates that our model performs. So we decided to apply this model to our .nl zone. We didn't apply it to all domain names because then we were afraid that the abuse analyst at SIDN and ICS would have to annotate too many examples. So we applied it to 30K .nl names. Within this subset, we found 1,407 suspicious domain names. And those 1,400, they are also plotted on the graph at the bottom of the slide. And here the green ones are the true positives. So they were labeled by the analysts as being a real fake web shop, which is kind of funny, a real fake web shop. But there were also some false positives, around 300 false positives. And some of the domain names that our model classified as suspicious were not reachable anymore when the analysts started to annotate them. So around 70% was a true positive, and for those true positives, we again notified registrars, and 774 or 84% was actually taken down, which again was a great success for our project. So then we had two detection systems that I covered, and we had two case studies to answer 2 research questions. So the first research question, how many fake web shops are there? Well, there are thousands of fake web shops within the .nl zone. The second question, can we do something about it? Yes, we can do something, but it's very important to cooperate with registrars and also other organizations like the credit card issuer. Then I would like to move to the final research questions. How do counterfeiters operate? And to answer this question, we basically analyzed all the suspicious domain names that we found to see whether there were some patterns. And I want to highlight here the main conclusions. So one of the conclusions is that there were thousands of domain names, thousands of fake web shops. And this is I wouldn't say strange, but it's something that is, you could also do it in a different way. You could also register as an adversary 1 or 2 domains and really think about how you would like to develop those domain names. But the counterfeiters did something else. They developed a production farm of fake web shops, and we think that they do that to spread their chances. Because if you have thousands of domain names, it's quite difficult to take them all down, especially for an government organization or a brand protection organization. And this strategy of registering so many domain names, we also see that in our data. Because if you want to register many domain names, you would assume that the registrars also prefer cheap registrars, and that's what we see. The counterfeiters use cheap registrars that also offer APIs. What we also see is that the counterfeiters don't think too much about their names. They mainly register domain names that have been used in the past. And what you can see on the plot here also is that they register it very fast. So when a canceled domain name becomes available, the counterfeiters usually register it within a few days. So for example, within 5 days, over 80% is already re-registered by counterfeiters. And we think they do that because they could benefit from the trust that domain names have within search engines. We also see similarities on the content level. The web pages, they look very similar. So it seems like they're using scripts and the same template over and over again, although there are some differences. So for example, the color sometimes differs, or there are slightly different products that are being advertised. Another thing that we observed in the data is that the counterfeiters don't care that much about their domain names. It seems that the domain names are sort of disposable. We see that because the domain names have relatively short lifetimes. On the plot again here you can see the distribution of the domain lifetime. And what you can see is that most of the domain names are not renewed after a year. 80% is not renewed after a year, and almost 90% is not renewed after 2 years. And this is something different that we observe with regular web shops, because here people really invest time in their web shop and don't cancel that domain after a year or after 2 years. Another thing that we see is that the domain names do not match the content. So for example, you can have a domain name in its name, it suggests some content, for example, about a grocery or about a medical shop, but instead there is a fake web shop hosted that sells shoes. So that's really, really strange. We also see that the counterfeiters don't care that much about the web page itself, so we see quite some spelling mistakes or translation errors. They probably just use Google Translate to generate a web page in Dutch. So then a final observation is that we see that many registrations seem to come from China. We, for example, see that in the email provider that registrants use when they register a domain name. So here you see on the x-axis a couple of email providers, the most frequent ones, and on the y-axis the number of suspicious domain names that were related to that email provider. And you can see that registrants prefer email providers like 163.com, but also Sina.com. And those are email providers that are very popular in China. They're like the Gmail in China. And of course, those email providers are not very frequently used within the Netherlands. So that's something that suggests that registrations come from China. We also see a pattern if we look at the hour of registration. I plotted that here on this slide. Here you can see on the x-axis the hour of registration within the Netherlands. So that's Amsterdam time. And on the y-axis, again, you can see the number of suspicious domain names. What you can see on those plots is that most of the domain names, most of the suspicious domain names are registered in the night, during the night in Amsterdam. But if you shift the time axis, the time zone, then you would see that this sort of maps with the time zone in China, in Beijing. So that's something strange. And especially if you look at the decrease around 4 o'clock at night in Amsterdam, that kind of exactly maps with the lunch break in China. So that's kind of funny. So to conclude, what did we do in this research? Well, most of all, we helped to take down over 4,000 counterfeit webshops. And by doing so, we ultimately protected .nl users and we had some impact in the real world. So that's really cool. But we also learned a couple of things. One of the things that we learned is that it's very important to cooperate with other organizations. So for example, the registrars helped us to actually take down domain names, but also collaborating with organizations that have a more direct relationship with consumers. In our case, ICS, that's very important. And it helps you to get a better ground truth if you want to do something like machine learning as well. What we also saw is that the detection systems that we used, they were very simple, but still they worked. And that was a lesson for us. It means that you don't have to design a very complicated system when you start with a project. It's very efficient if you just start simple and make it a bit more complex in a later phase. However, this also suggests that the counterfeiters most likely didn't perceive that much pressure, because the very simple brand counter detector just worked. But after a couple of months, a couple of years, we had to do something more intelligent. So counterfeiters didn't perceive that much pressure, but they adapt to our systems. Another thing that we learned is that we as a registry have a very good vantage points to tackle these kind of abuses. There are many fake web shops. Like I already mentioned, the counterfeiters, they register thousands of domain names, but we have the list of all .nl domain names. So we could easily scan or scrape or do anything else to get an understanding of what are patterns within those fake web shops. But as I already mentioned, we expect and we also see that the counterfeiters try to trick our system, so it will be a whack-a-mole game that will continue forever. So we have designed a new system. I plotted on the right side of this slide sort of an overview how the system looks like. So what we do now, we generate classifications for fake web shops, but we use the evaluation as labels to retrain our classification model. And by doing so, we hope to spot trends very early. And we also hope that we can continue to protect .nl users from being scammed. So thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer your question.